Greetings and happily miserable Labor Day to all of you accursed out there. Yep, we're recording this one bright and early on Labor Day morning, and a day of non-laborious lemon heart rum sampling awaits me to drown my sorrows after another rider lost last night. Can't beat anybody. Anyway, what the fuck? Herle here, joined by Kory Teneycke, this time from Paris, not the Ontario version of Paris. Jordan Leichnitz is here too. She's got a big day ahead of her. We'll hear all about that. The Scott Reid tour of UK public houses and ancient universities that would never accept him continues this week in Ireland. Scott and his mortally wounded liver will be back with us next week. All right, here's the rundown today. Big political story to start, the collapse of BC United, how and why and what happens from here. Fun times. Our cursed clipping is John Ibbotson's piece in today's Globe on the Liberal staffer revolt. Then back to BC to preview the upcoming federal Liberal caucus retreat in Nanaimo. Kory, before we get to you, Jordan, you're going to the Labor Day parade today.
I will.
What is the Labor Day parade?
Well, it's a great chance for a lot of the union locals and supportive folks come out, and there's a parade in downtown Ottawa, and then they finish in a public park where they do what is, in my view, the greatest thing ever. They pay to reopen the wading pool for one more day for the kids who come to the parade and in the neighborhood, and there's like a barbecue and bouncy castles, and yeah, it's actually a super fun event. So,
is it a fun parade with floats and balloons, or is it like a forced march?
No, it's definitely a fun parade. It's definitely a fun parade. Yeah, I mean, you should come. You should come. It's a good time. Kory, you can bring your fancy car. It'll be great. We can do a little Curse of Politics float.
I'll get my For the People license plate put on.
There we go.
Perfect.
You're doing well. Are those clothes all you have left after your trip to the Monte Carlo casinos?
Yeah. Oh, I've been having so much fun. Yes. I had some very hardcore James Bond LARPing, driving up to the Monte Carlo casino in Monaco. That was pretty fun. And just enjoying France. It's like wine. It's about a quarter of the cost. The food is amazing. Despite what you've heard, the people are actually incredibly friendly and polite. And it's been a lot of fun. Maximum relaxation.
You make it sound so progressive, but let me ask you this question. Can you drink wine in the 7-Eleven?
I haven't seen a 7-Eleven to know whether you can. But you can in the Spar, which I think is their version of the 7-Eleven.
David, we can't have nice things here.
I think you can buy beer and wine in preschools here, actually. I think it goes to that level. Yes, it's everywhere.
All right, let's talk about some politics. Pretty remarkable story out in BC. Last Wednesday, Kevin Falcon, leader of the BC United, formerly the BC Liberal Party, shut down the party unexpectedly and endorsed the Conservatives, who are led by a man Falcon threw out of his caucus. By the time it happened, it seemed a formality because support for BC United had disappeared. But fuck, it happened quickly, you guys. Happened so quickly. In April of 2023, the BC Liberals were about at 35% support, and the BC Conservatives were at about 5%. Okay? When Falcon pulled the plug, it was at about 40% Conservative, 10% BC United. So two things happened. The numbers started to move in April of 2023, and two things happened around that time, and I want to throw this into the mix for the two of you. One of which is that the BC Liberals rebranded to BC United, and it appeared that created massive confusion among the voters. The second thing, though, that happened is that support for Poilievre and the federal Conservatives took off nationally and in BC. They went from mid-30s to almost 50 points in British Columbia. So I imagine both of those things were big factors. But let's just go back to the main story. And Kory, tell me what you were thinking when you heard this was going down.
I was thinking maybe they're Curse of Politics listeners, because I think the suggestion was it was time to die with dignity.
Yeah,
I don't know if the dignity bar was met, but
I saw no dignity.
Well, it was still an assisted suicide. Like, this wasn't. He didn't wait for the polls. Like, the party was going to be dead one way or the other, but they decided to pull the pin on it before. So Yeah, I think it is. It is a case of ending it on their own terms, is what we saw happen. And it was going to one way or the other. And so I think you have to kind of take what Falcon said in his closing press conference at face value, like the prospect of an NDP government and having carved on his political tombstone be that he wouldn't accept reality and help get the NDP reelected. I don't think that's what he wanted the capstone on his political career to be. I think he wanted it to be something a little bit more magnanimous. I got to think that part of what's adding to the ethos in which that decision was being made is what we've seen in the U.S. with Biden. I don't think there was a lot of willingness on the upfront side for Biden to step down, but in the end, it's opened up a pathway for the Democrats that didn't exist before. I think I think his image and legacy is going to be much better as a result of having made that decision. I think that's probably playing in the background of people's thinking in British Columbia right now, including Kevin Falcon's. But I don't live inside his head, so I don't know that for sure. But you can't help but think about that as being as part of the context of it.
Jordan, what caused, in your view, this massive switch from BC Liberals, BC United to the Conservatives?
Well, I think it's really predominantly about Poilievre's coattails. This is really the factor that we saw lighted up, if you will. I think the conditions were there already. The bungled name change certainly didn't help, but also what that symbolized in terms of broader problems within the BC Liberals at that point. They weren't gaining traction. They were really having a very difficult time going after the BC NDP. And so as part of that rethink, they were a weakened party. They were, Falcon's leadership, I think, never really shone in any way there. And then the decision to rebrand without sort of fully understanding the confusion and the consequences that it could cause collided with this moment of increased interest in the Conservative brand. And so I think, it's fascinating, right? This is such a unprecedented type thing to have happen before an election. Normally you would see this type of press conference after an election. So to have it beforehand is really remarkable. But it's also, the federal Conservative pull, the pull of Poilievre, is both a strength, but it's also a bit of a weakness for Restad, right? Like, people are not really necessarily flocking to the BC Conservatives because they have positive views of him. It's far more about the lift that the federal Conservatives are providing to that brand overall. So that leaves, I think, some pretty important space for the BC NDP to go in and define Restad still. And they're going to be doing that, I think, really, really aggressively in the weeks to come.
Kory, just to pick up where Jordan left off there about Restad, is kind of untested in this capacity, is thought to be on the out of the mainstream on a few issues. I mean, he got thrown out over not believing in climate change, for example. I don't know how much that's going to hurt him in BC or not in this election, but he's untested. He's likely to have some candidates that are going to say some shit that's going to get in trouble, etc. The money ran out on Falcon and the BC United. Like, they had no money anymore. Nobody was giving them money anymore for the reasons you identified. If you were running their campaign and you had money, would you have thought it was over anyway? Or would you have still thought there's a way to beat back the Restad movement?
I think it was over anyway. Like, you got to think of how much money they spent. Like, they spent millions of dollars on their advertising campaign to attempt to, unfuck the launch of the party. And but that gets talked about a lot more than I think is worthy, because you talk to pollsters who have been doing a lot of work in the area. Everybody knew that BC United was the old BC Liberal Party. Like, it's not like no one knew. Like, I think that's a myth. I think there is some brand equity there in BC Liberal. But you listen to pollsters who are working there, and they say bring together a focus group and you talk people through who are kind of swing voters. Yeah, they were aware of what the change was. I think there are bigger things than just the conservative brand, although I think that's part of it. There's bigger things than just the lift that Poilievre is giving them, but I think that's part of it. Let's remember that the BC Liberals brought in a carbon tax. And a carbon tax in the current context is about the most unpopular policy you could ever hope to be associated with. And there was only one party that was very clearly from the get-go against a carbon tax.
Right.
So I think it's more than there's this over focus in punditry around the party branding and not nearly enough on what you see driving the electorate in every other part of the country. And I don't think BC is an exception, which is an affordability crisis in which a carbon tax is immensely unpopular. And you only had one party that was actually campaigning against a carbon tax. So, I think that is a far bigger lesson to be taking away from this. And I don't think it gets talked about nearly enough.
Jordan, I'm interested in whether you think that the movement was driven by policy or practicality. Because I have this history. When I got involved in the Saskatchewan Liberal Party, it had recently been very powerful. Mm-hmm. And was, at the time I joined, deader than a goddamn doornail. But within the previous decade, it had governed the province, and it had sent MPs to Ottawa. And I was trying to so I spent a fair bit of time trying to figure out what happened to it. And yeah, like Falcon, the Saskatchewan Liberals probably didn't present as clear an alternative to the NDP as the emerging Conservative Party did. But I think there also came to be a belief that they couldn't beat them anymore, in part because of the Liberal brand. Mm-hmm. And so people that wanted to defeat the NDP lost confidence in the Saskatchewan Liberals as the vehicle with which to do that and started to look for something else that they could. So I'm interested, if you go back to BC now and what's just happened, did people decide that Falcon couldn't beat Horgan, who's running, or Eby, because he's running pretty consistently 10 points behind him or so, and that started to frustrate people? Or was it that things like the carbon tax that Kory's talking about?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's an either or. I mean, I would certainly see both at play. I think that the degree to which the BC Liberal brand had become tired and of course comes with a lot of its own governing baggage, and the fact that I think
the Liberal brand's in the toilet.
Right, the Liberal brand is in the toilet federally, but also the BC Liberal brand had its own problems as well. With when you have governments in recent memory that left in a fair bit of disarray and disgrace, like people they didn't have good feelings about it, right? So you had two compounding factors there, right? You had the baggage that came from the BC Liberal brand itself and the governing history and all of that, and then you had the tanking of the federal Liberal brand. I'm not sure I would maybe ascribe as much weight to the policy debates as Kory does. I think the issue around the carbon tax and the BC Liberals proposing that, that is all well sort of in the past. I think for most folks in BC now, it was a lot more about where was that anti-BC NDP vote going to go? What did they view as their viable path? And there was excitement around the Conservative brand, and there was fatigue and just a lack of interest and connection around BC Liberals, BC United, and Falcon. And also just the way that when you have those lengthy internal debates in a party, that just is so repellent to voters. I also think you can't discount that. There was navel gazing for really a prolonged period there that led up to the name change. And it's not just about the name change being bungled. It's about really what all that represented in terms of how the party was actually functioning and connecting with voters, which is to say that it wasn't. So I think that people were more willing to look at Restad as a vehicle. Now, the question is, what happens now? So he's a fairly untested vehicle in this sense. And I think that one of the things, and maybe it goes without saying, but we can say it anyways, is that the math is not straightforward, right? It's not like you don't just go, You don't go BC United plus BC Conservative equals now that vote universe. There are going to be a number of those voters, BC United, former BC Liberal voters, who are not going, who just will not vote for the BC Conservatives, because it's not a consolidation of those centrist and the center right voters. That party is further right in a lot of material ways than BC United. And so there's a segment of those voters, so maybe somewhere between 20 and 30% of those voters, who are very open to voting for the BC NDP. So, we talk a lot about this being a consolidation of the right, but really he's also, what has happened has also consolidated centrist voters in BC in a way that I think we may see being a bit unpredictable.
Yeah,
well, we do have one.
Go ahead.
We do have one serious pollster that has come out since this, which is Angus Reid. And what are you seeing? You're seeing like the BC Conservatives are up a point above now. Instead of pulling 3-4 points behind the NDP, they're polling 1 point ahead. So, I think that kind of challenges some of what you're saying there, Jordan. And let's not forget that this is almost all BC Liberal people. Like Russ Adams himself was a Christy Clark cabinet minister, and what are the headlines and stories that have been?
But none of the more liberal people are involved.
Yeah, well, Falcon's not a liberal person.
No, he's not.
That's also true.
So the whole decision, or series of decisions that have been being made here, where are the defections to the NDP? Who's picking up and leaving that caucus and joining the NDP? The answer is no one. And you saw not only people in caucus, you saw nominated candidates leaving. You saw, large sections of the staff leaving. So, by the time Falcon decided to throw in the towel, a lot of the people in the party had picked up and already left. And I would question on a riding by riding basis how much that was going on that you don't really get to see in the headlines. But if I could speculate based on what we went through with the Reform Party in Saskatchewan, for instance, in the 90s, by the time that process had ended, basically everyone below the rank of captain, or maybe even a higher rank, maybe everyone below the rank of colonel, had already joined the Reform Party.
I'm 45 years on from high school, hurly-burlyites, but it's the week after Labor Day, and I still can't shake the same feeling in the pit of my stomach. Excitement, mixed with a little fear, and confusion about why they call it a duotang. I finally looked it up. Duo is Latin for two. Tang is an Old Norse word for a sharp metal object fastened to a handle. Get it now? Me neither. In case you haven't figured it out already, this week's ad from our presenting sponsor, TELUS, centers on back to school and those essential school supplies. Should a cell phone be considered an essential school supply? I'll leave that one to the legislators. So let's talk about the paper, pencils, rulers, workbooks that maybe you took for granted just a little. The fact is, not all families have the means to provide these things to their kids. TELUS believes every child deserves an equal opportunity to thrive in their school journey and to start the school year with confidence and the tools they need to succeed, regardless of their financial situation. So almost 20 years ago, they created their Kits for Kids program. It's a brand new backpack filled with the stuff that made for a fresh start to each school year. Pencil case, coloring pencils, HB pencils, pens, erasers, ruler, exercise books, and loose leaf paper. All right, time for a quick arithmetic assignment. Take out your pencils and paper and no cheating. If TELUS has given out 225,000 kits for kids since 2006 and 20,000 this year alone, how many smiling faces has that produced across the country? Let me see. Carry the one, add to the next column. Geez, never mind. I'm like Jethro Bodine. I'm terrible at math, but it was a trick question anyway. The answer is incalculable. Learn more at TELUS.com, Kits for Kids. So just let me stick with you, Kory, because I really do think, though, that there's something to what Jordan says, because the history of BC tells me that when there is a center-right coalition party, like the Socreds for many years, or like the BC Liberal Party was, that party beats the NDP 4 elections out of 5. That basically the NDP are kind of a safety valve for when the government's been in for 20 years and it's time to go in that circumstance. The question is whether Rustad is building or can build a center-right coalition, or whether he's going to run a more hard-right party against the NDP, which probably changes that calculation.
Well, there is a third party that has a substantial share of the vote, and it's the Greens, which is something that hasn't been there in the past. But if you go back to the Socred days, there were rump parties, not just two parties. It wasn't the NDP and the Socreds. You had rump parties that existed at that time too. You've had the same in Saskatchewan. You've had I don't think it's that different. But I guess what I'm saying is that the BC Conservative Party is looking a lot like the BC Liberal Party, except it's leaning a little more in the conservative direction than the liberal direction. But if you're looking at who's making it up, it's basically BC Liberal people. You're maybe having a bit of a change in complexion at the very leadership side, but I'm not sure below that there's a clear evidence that a lot has changed here.
Yeah.
Jordan, take
I
one
don't know.
crack at this.
Yeah, my feeling is I think this is far more a story of the center-right really vanishing. Like, this wasn't a merger. This was a complete surrender on the part of the former BC Liberals. And I do think that there are already signs that...
It was like something from Shogun. The guy brought his sword right in front of Rustad and impaled himself.
And if you haven't seen the press conference, you should watch. It is spectacular in every way, right? And I think, the unpredictability is not done. So we now are hearing from Rustad that they're going to revet all of their candidates over 6 weeks away from an election, right? And I don't know about you guys, but any campaign I've been on who's revetting their candidates 6 weeks out from an election, it doesn't typically end very well. But it's also
you can never vet them often enough.
Well, that had been going on though, but that had been going on for months.
Right, but not fast enough. My point is...
Well, they'd removed, I don't know, what is it, like 10 of their candidates were removed on that basis?
There's still more. And my point is this, right? The kookiness is not gone. It's really woven into the fabric of the BC Conservatives. A lot of those people are candidates. There's complete disarray now about who's going to stand in various ridings and some internal opaque process about how that's going to be determined that I can't imagine is very rallying for folks who were on the BC United side and gave of their time to do that. But look, here's the thing. So that means that issues about candidates and the extremism and the weird views of some of these candidates are going to continue to be coming out, are going to continue to be in the news and the top of mind. And I think for EB, if the BC NDP is able to make this an issue of leadership, if you stack up EB beside Rustad and you ask people who do they view as the more credible, competent leader, and that is the ballot question, then that favors the BC NDP. And the disarray that we've seen in the wake of this, and the fact that Rustad, by the way, was still out like 2 days ago on CBC saying that he doesn't think that climate change is an emergency and repeating some of those same really problematic fringe views about climate change that got him into trouble in his previous life. Like, it doesn't suggest to me that he's really made a shift to consolidate that center-right vote. He is running the exact same type of campaign that he was running prior to this press conference. So that leaves a big opportunity for EB and the BC NDP to go out and to define him to voters who are looking at him seriously for the first time. And I think, if I know Marie de la Matia at all, she's going to go out and she's going to put a lot of money behind that. And I think that could actually be quite powerful.
It'd be very helpful if NDP were to run that, because I recognize the problem with the guy dressed in a red beret right now talking about silliness. But there's a bit of kookiness that is bred into BC politics, not into the Conservatives or the NDP. But the notion that climate change is not the biggest crisis facing people in British Columbia right now, I think is a head nodder for people. When I look at polling, that's what I see. That is what I see. BC does not poll typically differently than the rest of the country on all of this stuff. And that is a very different statement than saying there is no such thing as climate change. But I'll tell you what is it is a head nodder. It is where the public is at, that there are more important things for the government to be focused on right now.
I think that's a more solid line, by the way, Kory. Kory, I don't want to disagree with you fundamentally, but I do think that a more solid line would be where it is in the priority list right now, as opposed to whether or not it's a real thing.
Well, that's the statement that I heard being made, and he's been questioned on this many times. I don't think that what Rustad is saying is climate change is a fake thing, but the fact that is the obsession of the government is, I think, a criticism that is leveled at the federal Liberal Party as well right now to great effect. Like, I think there's a lot of votes in that message. I would also say, if we're talking about kookiness and competence, the absolute mismanagement of drug policy in British Columbia and its propagation across the rest of the country is highly, highly unpopular. And that's maybe why the NDP is running at like record speed away from those decisions. So, when you hear Poilievre talking about policies being kooky, that is the one that is, generally in the crosshairs when he makes that statement. And that is also a head nodder. It's also a head nodder. And that is a policy that is engineered by David Eby.
Yeah, I think Eby made moves on that early enough that we'll see how it plays. But look, I think that the campaign needs to do two things. Obviously, they need their good attack on Rustad. They need money behind that, which they're going to do. And then they need to pivot to the things that people in British Columbia are really worried about. And that's housing, that's affordability, and that's healthcare. And then there's lots for them to go after, the BC Conservatives on as well. Like, we haven't seen a lot of policy from them, but what we have seen is things that, put forward more privatization of healthcare. So there's like a target-rich environment for them, I think, on both fronts. And they just need to they got to run really hard on that. They have to run really hard on both fronts. And we'll see if Eby's able to do that. But I like that fight. I like Eby versus Rustad. I think Rustad's got the charisma of a cardboard box and a whole bunch of really strange views that he can be drawn into. And he's got an entire slate full of candidates, the majority of whom are potential liabilities. And there's buckets and buckets of opposition research just waiting to go after them. So I think it's going to be an exciting few weeks.
So, Jordan, I'm going to wrap up this section because we have to move on. I'm going to wrap up this section by saying, because of all the uncertainty around BC, the BC Conservatives, I would still probably put some money on Eby to win this election. But the BC NDP situation has deteriorated so badly in the last 6 months just because of the movement from a completely split opposition to a united opposition has turned what was a laugher of an election campaign into a close election campaign. I agree with that. And not many people in politics have had more momentum in a 12-month period than fucking Rustad has. That is crazy what's going on out there.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Liberal MPs are gathering for a national caucus meeting in Nanaimo this week, so we shall persist in reminding them about the contributions our sponsor, CN, makes to the economy outside the proverbial doors of their retreat. British Columbia has two major seaports, the Port of Vancouver and the Port of Prince Rupert, which is actually the closest naval departure point for Asia on the west coast of North America. Both ports plug into Canada's vast trade arteries and handle billions of dollars of incoming and outgoing cargo a year, much of it moved by CN. CN employs 2,657 railroaders in BC and operates more than 2,800 route miles of track. Sidebar, did you know Canadian railways measure distance in miles? In the past 10 years, the railway has spent more than $3.3 billion building out and reinforcing its network in the province. Just about the entire output of British Columbia's forestry sector moves by train at some point. Same goes for minerals from BC mines and manufactured products from BC factories. Given the wild terrain in that spectacular province, hauling cargo can sometimes be tricky. CN's tracks hug mountainsides, follow rivers, disappear into forests. Doing that safely requires training and practice. Earlier this month, as the mayor of Smithers and his councillors watched, CN, along with the RCMP and various first responders, staged a mock derailment and fuel spill on the Bulkley River. That exercise takes place annually around BC, and throughout this hot, dry summer, CN's mighty firefighting trains have deployed to help contain wildfires in the province. I should mention here that CN both supports and relies upon Indigenous communities across BC. No one else possesses their level of expertise in environmental stewardship. Anyway, the fact is, the relationship between the railways and BC goes clear back to the founding of our country. Its importance to Canada's economy is self-evident. All right, let's move on to our clipping of the day, which comes to us from the esteemed John Ibbotson in the Globe and Mail. And he's writing about the fact that last Wednesday, 52 Liberal ministerial staffers signed a letter saying that they were so angry with the government's policy supporting Israel, as they put it, and not being supportive enough of the Palestinian side of that debate, that they would not campaign, this is their principled position, that they would not campaign in the upcoming crucial Montreal by-election on behalf of the Liberal Party. John Ibbotson about this writes, while many of us started our political careers in elections as volunteers, we can no longer in good conscience campaign for a party that excludes us and our values, they wrote, demanding that the Liberal government condemn Israel's actions and recognize Palestine as a state. I have to say, and this is now Ibbotson after quoting the letter, Ibbotson says, I have to say I have never heard of anything like this at any level of government ever. Ibbotson's only been covering politics in Canada for about 35 years. Ministerial staffers are not public servants. They are hired to work for and promote their minister and their government. During elections and by-elections, they leave their job and work on the campaign. They are party partisans. These partisans have gone on strike. Former MP Marlene Jennings was one of a number of Liberal loyalists who publicly expressed their outrage at the mutiny. If those staffers actually had the little bit of democratic values, fundamental ethics, they would have resigned en masse, she tweeted. But they don't, do they? All right, Jordan, I want to hear from you, obviously. But since your experience in the NDP is with unionized staff on Parliament Hill, I want to start with Kory, who I think has a more Liberal-like experience. Right? I don't know, Kory, at any time that I worked in politics, this would have been cause for summary dismissal.
Yeah, and should have happened, I think. I think there's a lack of honor in those staffers putting that out. And I think there is a lack of appropriate response in not firing them. That sort of approach is not appropriate. It's just not what these jobs are. You're
a nobody in that job, right? You are a fucking nobody.
You're not in elected office.
Yeah.
And look, we look down our nose at caucuses and the quality of some of the people that you find in there at times. But at the end of the day, look, political staff are that. They're staff. And even at the cabinet level, like you guys had a really, I think, good conversation on the Chiefs, on the hurly-burly around this. And I gotta say, there was, across the board consensus on it. And I didn't disagree with a word that I heard in that discussion. You're there to offer opinions, yes, to the person that you're working for, be it the prime minister or the premier or the minister of whatever, or the MP from wherever, or the MPP from wherever. And your voice ends at that point. And when a decision is made, you're there to help execute on it. Like, that is your role. You're not an independent center of power with the authority to act independent of those who were elected to play that role. Your job is to fall in line and do your job. And of course, if you have an ethical issue about where the government has gone on something, feel free to submit your resignation. And feel free to do that in a public way, I guess, if you want to. I would question how honorable that is too. But the idea that you can go on strike on an issue like this and then sit down calmly at your desk and keep doing your job is, I think, a fucking delusion. Like, get out, leave.
Entitlement. Jordan, What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say anything other than that if that is your closely held view as a political staffer, then you probably should step down. It's not the political aspects of the job are not particularly optional. And I think that what is so damaging about this is also the context in which it was done. So it wasn't just about saying, look, we're not gonna participate in aspects of the work like to have that conversation internally. We're not going to participate in certain aspects of the work that we have a deeply held conviction around. It was designed to inflict political injury on their own party and to help an opponent. So delighted though I may be to see that type of chaos visited upon them, if it were my party and I were in a managerial position there, I would be really troubled. But look, I want to say a few other things because I think that there's other stuff going on here, and it's easy to shit on a bunch of young staffers about what's happening here, but there is also a broader context. And that is, number one, this issue has just absolutely polarized within the Liberal Party, within Canadian society. So it's a sign of the pressure that what's happened in Gaza, the tragedy there, and everything has put on not just the Liberals, but broader Canadian society. And it's also a sign that these staffers just don't see a future in this party. Like, would you do that if you thought you were going to be in that role a year from now? I don't think so. So these are folks who don't see a path forward for themselves in the party. It's also a sign of completely broken internal issues management. I'm sure that both of you have also had this experience when you're in a leadership position in a party where you do have groups of people, be they in caucus, be they staff, who do have deeply held views and who are organizing on something. Well, in a functioning party, that is dealt with internally. And you can have those hard discussions. And I think certainly those hard discussions are frequently held within the NDP. And I imagine that that's the case in every other party as well. But for something to bleed over into a public demand like this, that's something that's broken internally in that issues management process. And so I think that actually shows us that there's a pretty big systems issue there. And then the last thing I would say is that for these staffers, and remembering just sort of where we are also in the life of the government, and that likely these staffers are not the ones that entered, when Trudeau first became prime minister. So we're now into third and fourth generation staffers as we get towards the end of a mandate. Like, why would they think differently about their role? What in their experience would have led them to think that the Liberal Party right now is not the place for that sort of discussion, or that those views would not be welcome? So I think that actually, if you look at what their demands are, they're not, they're not super dramatically out of line.
But
really.
wait, Jordan, I just want to jump in here.
They have, I just want to finish, and this goes a little bit to the discussion you had with the Chiefs. They joined a movement, right? They joined a party under Justin Trudeau that had rebranded itself as a movement that welcomed this kind of big tent discussion, and valued, ostensibly the opinions of people who were part of that movement. And so I also think that there's an expectations mismatch here in terms of what's going on.
They're not a member of the party. They're a member of the government. So if you want to join the Liberal Party, even before all these changes and movement and all that kind of stuff, if you want to join the Liberal Party and move resolutions that it should support a Palestinian state and back away from any support of Israel, go ahead. That's what political parties are for. If you want to try to recruit a new leader who supports your position, go ahead. That's what political parties are for. I'm not saying the debate's remotely illegitimate to have in a party context, but when you take a staff job, you're not a party activist anymore.
I agree with you, but what I want to say is that what is happening in the internal culture of the PMO, of the Liberal caucus office, of the minister's office, suggests to me that, like, why would they think otherwise? They obviously don't share that opinion. So they have a different assessment of what their role is. And I can't imagine that came out of nowhere.
Right. It's got to be a culture thing that has been built.
A culture thing, but I wonder to what extent it's a generational thing too.
I think that's also true.
Whether there's a bit of, my opinion matters most. This is the first generation of staffers who never heard the word no in their entire existence.
Governments and campaigns are command and control structures, and maybe they don't like that command.
Well, but Kory, the other thing, of course, also is that political opinion on what's happening in Israel and Gaza also splits along generational lines. So it's not, I don't think this is necessarily an issue of entitlement, but there is a generational split. That is
well,
true.
I think you've seen in other workplaces, like internal discussion groups and things like that being like, the number of people who think it's appropriate to go on their work discussion forum and talk politics, or their views on this conflict or that conflict, like that's been a challenge in a lot of other workplaces too, and there really is, I think, a generational aspect to it. Like no one has to hear your opinion on every fucking thing under the world when you go to work. Like, in fact, it's inappropriate. But I'm not sure that inappropriateness is shared equally across generational divides. I think there's I think that's probably more of it. But either way, there is a reality that people have to live in, and the reality is that these are government jobs, and your job is not to act as the official opposition within the staff. So anyway, polish up on your resume and get the fuck out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my view is a little different, and maybe because there's a little bit more of a tradition of the activist to staffer pathway within our party. So this is a pretty familiar thing. And look, I agree that when you are a political staffer and there is a decision made about the party and what direction the party is going, at that point, it becomes like a caucus solidarity, right? Like that is the move and you were going. And if you have a fundamental moral and ethical problem with that direction, then you should probably part ways. But I do think that staffers who have deeply held views and who sit in those positions have a unique platform, and that they're well within their rights to express their views internally and to have those discussions internally. But what's broken in this is that somehow that internal discussion was not handled maybe, or was mishandled. We don't really know what happened there. And now it's become a public weapon with which to hurt their own party. And that, I think, is
what
really
they're withholding,
strange.
though. It's not even a debate around a policy, though. Like, this is why I think it's so egregious. They're withholding, the efforts that normally staffers would have in terms of campaigning in a riding. Like, they're trying to punish the party by having it lose a seat. Like, it is. But
which, frankly, may happen without their intercession anyway.
But it's the opposite of what they're paid to do. It's the opposite of what they're paid to do.
You're working in the weapons factory and you're sabotaging it. Like you're pulling parts out of the tank and throwing them in the back corner. Like it's sabotage. It's political sabotage.
I think a lot of it has to do with this whole movement business and the restructuring of the party. I think they have a hard time finding partisan liberals for staff jobs. So they hire people that are interested in policy areas, coming out of university and shit like that, right? Because they don't have the young liberal and campus liberal pipeline to hire partisans that they used to have. So now it's more of a, hey, are you interested in working for the Minister of Transportation, right?
But if there's not an internal culture that helps people make that bridge between being an interested political, and I don't want to completely shit on these staffers. I think they're probably very bright, interested people. I think that are doing what they view as the right thing. And so why was that energy somehow not, like, they don't view the Liberal Party being successful as the vehicle for that any longer? Like, that is fascinating to me.
But there is, like, as David pointed out, it's not about a debate being illegitimate. Like, let's just all be super clear on that. It's about, what you're using your role in a ministerial office to do. Like these debates happen all over politics and in every party. And some are more embraced than others, but I think there's a deep culture in the NDP to have, fierce policy battles at conventions. I think there's a deep culture of that in the Conservative Party. I think there's a deep culture of that in the Liberal Party as well. So all of these things are acceptable, right? In terms of the debate portion of it. What's unacceptable is the fact that you're using your ministerial role to have what is normally a party convention conversation.
But I'm just so interested that, I think whenever and all of us joined politics the first time, I imagine at some point someone sat you down and explained the unwritten rules of the job, right? Or you absorbed them by osmosis. That obviously did not happen here.
Yeah, but I mean, I've been
Which is
disappointed by the
fascinating.
Liberal Party on positions many, many times over the course of my life.
We all have been. We always will be. Like, that's the nature of these things, right? Like,
And
you're never going to have perfect policy alignment.
And particularly with the Liberal Party, it's pretty antithetical to the very nature of the Liberal Party to be a single issue voter.
Right.
Right.
Well,
it's a brokerage party.
Although less so now.
But I think I would say this is
not
actually
a brokerage party. It's
not a brokerage party, and this is what I mean when I say why would they expect different, right?
Yeah. Well, we're coming to a consensus through your assistance here, Jordan. Because right, but like a brokerage party wouldn't be campaigning on a fucking carbon tax right now. They just would not be. They would not be.
All right, let's keep with the sad Liberals and go on to their caucus retreat that's coming up next week in BC. We may touch on this next Monday again, but let's just do a quick round on this. They're probably holding it out there, hoping to give themselves a boost in BC, where their numbers have cratered from the mid-30s to about 20. Why do you laugh, Jordan?
I mean,
the dirt will not
irony lives. Irony lives. Like, to do it, I mean, I think in the wake of our first conversation, it's difficult to hold your caucus retreat anywhere west of Ontario at this point is an act of tremendous faith.
I don't know. We held a national caucus meeting in Regina in 2005. It changed everything. Swept Saskatchewan after that national caucus meeting. In any event, I'm going to be interested to see what the meeting is like. The PMO, as we'll all recall, declined demands from some quarters to have a meeting earlier this summer after the loss in St. Paul's, presumably because they thought it would be a negative session. Murphy, Top, and Brody on the Chiefs on the Herle-Burley seemed to think Cabinet last week would have been spending a fair bit of time talking about how to manage caucus going forward, which I think is interesting. I don't know what you expect, you guys, but my sense of the party right now is that it's not going to fight Trudeau. It's just quitting. And that's caucus and staff and volunteers. Nobody's going to stand up and tell him to go. They're just not going to work on it anymore.
It's remarkable.
Well, but the BC thing is just such an appropriate place to hold this, because I would say they could go and visit the tombstone of the BC Liberal Party, except the funeral hasn't even happened yet. And the dirt will not have been settled on the grave, let alone the tombstone installed. So it's but it's the same dynamic there. Like, by the time Falcon left, as we talked about, large chunks of their caucus and staff had either left or were, musing about leaving, right? It's the same sort of thing that we're seeing. Like, look, the loss of the Seamuses of the world, not good. It doesn't speak to the future. It's not like you're losing, it's not like Herb Gray resigning, after 50 years or whatever it was in politics. And it's like, well, that makes sense. Or, Charlie Angus saying he's not going to run again after a lengthy career. Because it's not, people who are retiring at the end. It's the future leadership of the party that is saying, you know what, I'm going to go and do something else. It's Pablo going off to the BC Liberal leadership, the Quebec Liberal leadership. That's what's happening. I completely agree. And look, maybe it'll just be Trudeau and Katie and a handful of ultra loyalists, riding into the election to bravely face defeat. I guess there was a certain level of honor in that, but it's easy to understand how not everyone wants to go out that way.
Yeah.
They won't enjoy that process. I remember that from 2018. You pull on levers and they're not connected to anything. There's nothing on the other end that does anything when you pull on it.
Someone has cut the cables.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they could stand to learn perhaps a little bit from the NDP, which is no matter how hopeless things look, God, you got to keep fucking running and try something, try something. And what I think is, a remarkable common thread in what we've talked about, actually really everything today, is the common thread is just that idea that within the Liberal Party, there just is no sense of a hope or a path out, and that people are absenting themselves, resigning themselves, or otherwise just checking out rather than challenging Trudeau and pushing things to a crisis point within the caucus. Like, just to go back to the staffers, like they would rather talk to the media than talk to the PMO, presumably.
Right.
And I think that there is a really that is such a difficult dynamic to get out of if there's no desire within cabinet, there's no desire within caucus to push things to a point to actually change something. And I mean, I'll have, I think, a little bit more to say about this in my Hey You, but if there were to be one thing to come out of this caucus meeting, I think there really has to be a sense from the Liberal MPs, and not just that they need to be heard for their complaints or their concerns in the wake of the by-election, but there needs to be a real plan articulated to do something different from what they are doing. Like, that is the real missing piece here. And we have talked a little bit about this, and our discussion on immigration, I think, was really interesting, because obviously now we're seeing perhaps a little bit of policy movement on that. And I think that there's a risk that some in the Liberal leadership could view that as a sufficient change. But what's actually happening there is that they're just trying to close what small distance there really was on the policy front between themselves and the Conservatives on this issue. They're just like, this is a shield thing. This is not actually going to move anybody. There's not enough contrast really between any of the parties on that topic right now for that to actually constitute a real change. And so I think there's a strong confusion here about making some policy shifts to deal with irritants, to deal with some negative pieces, and a fundamental strategic change about what this government is communicating to Canadians, who is doing the communicating. And they have left all of those bigger pieces on the table. And so if that is not the discussion in that caucus retreat, I don't know what the path is for these guys. But I'm also not clear on, if there's no one who's going to force that, then I guess they just, their plan to carry on losing can just continue.
Kory, let me just say this, in fairness. Let me just say this, that if you actually look at the 338 averages, okay, something has changed. It's not enormous. It's not what needs to happen for Liberals, but something has changed. And that is that not long ago, we were seeing numbers where the NDP and the Liberals were within 2 or 3 points of each other. Now, with the NDP down to 17 points and the Liberals up to 25, there's an 8-point spread between the Liberals and the NDP on a national basis. And the gap between the Conservatives and the Liberals, which used to be pretty reliably for a couple of months 20 to 22, now looks more like 17 on an ongoing basis. So something's happened. A little bit's happened.
Yeah, I think a little bit has happened, but and we've talked about this a little bit in past ones. I think some of the conservative attacks and the focus of conservative attack advertising more on the NDP is pushing their numbers down. And
yeah, I agree with that.
And I don't I don't think that's an accident. I think the people who are choosing to run those ads are looking at riding numbers and looking at where you're going to win the most seats, and I'm sure that is incredibly deliberate. But there is a taking of the focus off Trudeau a little bit. I think at a certain point, your opponent is so dead that they're unresurrectable, and you start seeing benefit in actually pushing another party down in certain regions and certain parts of the country. So, I do think if we're looking at what else has changed, that's new. There's more focus on the NDP attacks,
Mm-hmm.
and what you're seeing is the NDP numbers go down as a result. But I think that's
I agree with Kory 100% actually on that. I think that's very much what's happening. And we've talked about that dynamic a little bit in the past. And of course, the importance for the Conservatives of keeping that vote split and what happens when they are incautious and turn those dials too much one direction or the other. That can produce some unfavorable vote splits for them. But look, I think that also this can this can create some other knock-on effects. I think this could push the NDP into more risk-taking behavior. They need to shake off the Conservatives and the Conservative attacks. So I think that, the common thing that we're seeing here is that the Liberal weakness is unaddressed. There are other things potentially that are moving and that could move, but there's nothing that's really changed in sort of the fundamental pieces that are dragging the Liberals down. And there's really nothing in the numbers that suggests any movement around those. And so if I were going into that caucus meeting, I'd be really concerned about that. There are other pieces on the chessboard that absolutely can move, but your stuff seems very stuck still.
Right. Cool. All right. Let's ask Gordon Pinson to wind this up for us.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
Hey, Frenchman, you got a Hey You for us?
Yes, I do. Harkens back to our first topic. I think the Hey You needs to go out to Kevin Falcon this week, I think. That was an unprecedented move that took a lot of courage to actually step down. And so I think it bears mentioning. I think it was Biden-esque, and at the end of that, the chances that the NDP will be reelected have definitely been diminished. I don't think they're out of the woods. It's far from certainty, but it is a closer race, and I think the anti-NDP forces are in better stead as a result of that decision. And it was something that I'm sure was very difficult for him to do. So. Hey, Kevin Falcon, that was a brave move, and I think you'll be remembered better for having taken it.
All right. Labor Day homecoming queen, you got a Hey You for us?
I hope everybody's enjoying their paid vacation, their weekends, child labor laws. Look, so my Hey You is going to the Liberal MPs reluctantly dragging themselves down to BC for what is sure to be a meeting that has the air of a wake. I think you should consider doing something. One of the really big problems, as we've talked about and many others have talked about, is that you have senior staff in the PMO telling you to keep calm and stick to the message and carry on. But as I'm sure you've read elsewhere, the definition of stupidity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And I took a little screenshot because I wanted to, I sent this to you guys in the chat. I wanted to read this out because I think it really underlines the point. So this is some of the spin that's coming internally about what the path forward is for the Liberals. It's from a CBC article earlier this week about how they're drawing inspiration from the Democrats. Two MPs said Trudeau is already trying to match the Democrats' message of joy and optimism, pointing to a news conference this month where Trudeau spoke about the Olympics and Canadian pride. My people, this is malpractice. You absolutely must reject this garbage messaging you are being fed. This will not save you. And you have to have that conversation internally. This is the time. You cannot wait any longer. You've got to act. So that is my Hey You. It is uncharacteristically just wholesome, good advice for my opponents, and perhaps some of them will take me up on it. I wish you good luck because you're going to need it.
I want to see the word cloud of Canadians' thoughts about Trudeau right now and see where joy fits into that word cloud. Like, I don't think it's the big word right in the middle of that word cloud.
Did you watch that interaction that he had with the worker in Sault Ste. Marie, the steel worker?
I didn't.
It's.
I mean, the steel worker, Kory.
Yeah, well,
I heard he works for Ballingall.
He works for Ballingall.
Anyway,
Ballingall doesn't own a steel company, does he?
Oh, did the guy work for Ballingall? Oh,
yes, he worked for Ballingall.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. But I did like the line.
You hear that? You even fooled Kory.
No, that's fantastic.
AstroTurfing.
Jeff, I'm buying you a pint later. Anyway, I just thought the resignation of, you're not going to be here in a year anyway.
Yeah.
It was kind of, more what the association would be, irrelevance as opposed to joy.
Yeah. My Hey You goes out to anybody that works for a Liberal minister or member of Parliament, either in Ottawa or back in the constituency. If you are not 100% committed from now to the election campaign to get the Liberal Party elect as many members as possible, you really should quit right now. Like, if you are ambivalent about that outcome in any way, shape, or form, you should quit right now. The Liberal Party gets a couple of hundred people to be paid for by taxpayers to be Liberals. And the Conservatives have people that are paid to be Conservatives. NDP, and our Liberals have to be Liberals. You have to work. We have to need it. If we're going to do anything in this election campaign, we have to want it really badly. So check your personal egos and ambitions at the door and double down with your shoulder to the wheel. Let's get at this. All right. Thanks, you two. That was a lot of fun. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. I want to thank the Wandering Beret. I want to thank Jordan's hairstylist. I want to thank everybody who watched or listened to the show today. Thank you very much, and we will be back next week with more of The Curse of Politics and presumably Reid, for better or worse. See you then.